And here we go. I don't know whether you're hearing me. I hope you are. It looks like we are live. Is there a way that somebody can give me a hand or a comment and let me know? Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. Thanks, Jean. Zoe, terrific. Kevin, hi. Welcome. If you are already writing something today, if you are pushed to write to the point where today is one of those days, let me know in the chat. I wanted to share with you what has been my big discovery. I'm a book reviewer as well as a writer, and I review for 3 different sites. And that means that a lot of books come in here that are so-so. And then every now and then there's this terrific book. And I wanted to figure out, as I was working on this, what makes a really terrific read. And my secret that I found out eventually was that it's when the end of the book really satisfies the promise that you've made in the beginning. Jean, great, you're writing your first book, terrific. So when you make a promise in the beginning, what do I mean by that? I mean, what have you told the reader is coming up? For instance, I'm going to take a Robert Frost poem because there's a tradition among poets anyway, that you go to somebody who's really at the top of the field first and you read from them. And this is a famous one of his poems. It's called Mending Wall, and it's probably not the name that you've heard of before. Hey, Donna, good to see you. Here's how Mending Wall starts. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. Now, you know what the ending of it is? You'll recognize the ending right away. It's what the neighbor is saying back to him. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. So you see the beginning of the poem, even though it's a long poem, hinted at the ending. And that's, I think, one reason that Frost's poems are as successful and long-lasting as they are, is that that sense of bookends is there. The promise and then the fulfilling of the promise. Does it apply to fiction? Yeah, I think it does. If you are a cyber person at all, the term cyber came from William Gibson in his book, Neuromancer, some years ago now. And he launched a whole new wave of speculative fiction with it. And this is one of the ones I really like of his, Pattern Recognition. It begins 5 hours New York jet lag, and Case Pollard wakes in Camden Town to the dire and ever-circling wolves of disrupted circadian rhythm. It is that flat and spectral non-hour awash in limbic tides, brainstem stirring fitfully, flashing inappropriate reptilian demands. And the book ends with, and now it's late, close to the wolfing hour of soul lack, but she knows, lying curled here behind him in the darkness of this small room, that her soul has returned, at least for the meantime, reeled entirely in on its silver thread and warmly socketed. So even though the book is not specifically a romance, it's that tie between the characters that begins with the promise in the beginning and the ending. Nonfiction. I recently took a national award for a feature article on a grain farm. What's a grain farm? In Vermont here, it's what used to be a cow farm. And they've found that cows are no longer profitable. So now they're growing wheat, and the local farm actually has a mill to turn their wheat into flour. But what fascinated me was the people. So the beginning of the story actually spoke from the father's point of view, the generation older, talking about how he had come to the farm and how he asked for changes from his father, and they were not welcome. And the end of it goes back to that man and asks him, okay, how's it feel now that you're the older generation and you've got a younger generation making changes here? And he says, it's a lot easier than making them myself. And that's a sort of Vermont humor thing where you're being a little bit dark, and at the same time you're making a joke out of the whole thing, but you really mean it. So that sense of satisfaction is one of the reasons that the story ranked so high and ended up getting a national award. So that's poetry, fiction, nonfiction. I've got a few other examples here, but I wanted to show you also that it applies to something terribly short. Great, Kevin. I'm glad it's your favorite. And that is the haiku. You know what a haiku is, right? It's a 17-syllable poem. Well, we call it that anyway in English. In Japanese, there's more to it than that. There are ties to the season, but the most important part of it for a Japanese writer or reader is that the poem makes a twist as the last line comes along. And in fact, whatever we're writing, that twist is something that intrigues the reader, that gets the reader jerked into what we're writing. And yet you have to kind of balance it against, okay, what did you promise in the beginning? Is your twist going to take you too far away from the promise? Well, you're going to have to weave it back if you want the reader to say at the end of it, this was a really good read. So here's a haiku from Basho, who's probably the most famous Japanese haiku author. And you can hear the endings of the lines. Teeth sensitive to sand in salad greens. I'm getting old. So the twist obviously is before the last line. I'm getting old. But right at the beginning, teeth sensitive. I mean, that hints at what you're going to get for the last line. You don't know it. You don't know it until the last line comes up and goes boom. Yes, a haiku and a limerick are similar in that twist. Also, a really good sonnet has a twist. And in a sonnet, it's called the volta, or sometimes actually the twist. And it happens between the longer stanza and the shorter stanza. Hello, Mireille. I hope that's the right way to say it in the Netherlands. It looks like a French first name. And I'm glad that the saying is familiar there. So volta, good, all right. I use this when I'm writing a novel. And it's trickier with a long novel because, as you know, Jean, and as you know, Chris, right? You start off someplace that interests you, and then you start rolling. And you don't necessarily have the ending in mind. So how are you going to get there? How are you going to get to the point where you've got a really good piece done? Right, Donna? And for me, a lot of what I write on Medium has to do with trauma and recovery, or with strength and resilience. And those are kind of my areas. So I know that when I begin a story, I want something that's going to get you into it as, okay, something traumatic or dramatic is going to happen here. And I want you to be able to feel hopeful that I'm going to get out of there somehow. So the difference on Medium, and it's the same thing in a long novel, is that the end of a piece on Medium isn't necessarily the end of a story, right? You're going to have another piece that follows it many times. So on one of mine that I really like, the title is A Deadly Disorder. And I begin with the first time I entered the home of a hoarder, not the same as a collector, but a hoarder, around 1988 on a Vermont back road. And I talk about the stacks of things that are ready to fall down on me. The piece then goes on through going to the home of a family member and discovering that no one had realized this woman was a hoarder, and she had just died in the materials she hoarded. She'd fallen over into the piles and smothered there. I mean, talk about a nightmare. And it was, and it still is. But what I have to come to in the piece as I wrap it up is there's going to be another piece about this. But I said, what I needed at that point was to get the gas turned off. That was my absolute line, that there was a gas stove underneath all the junk somewhere, and my life was in danger. But I also needed to get out and breathe air that wasn't scented with the aromas of this pile of horrendous junk. So yes, poor woman, yes, but poor family also. I mean, nobody expected her death. And it was just like in a novel, it was that huge boom of shock. And then you go on from there. What are you going to do about it? And in the process of the doing, I came very slowly to the realization that I was probably living with a hoarder, although he had a different thing that he was hoarding, and it had different consequences. So some of the other things I have here are poems by Billy Collins, who is really good at laying out a beginning that promises you something important and taking you to the ending. Poems by Thomas Sayers Ellis If you are a person of color or the stories of persons of color draw you in, make sure you get Thomas Harris Ellis. And then two of my books, The Darkness Under the Water and The Long Shadow. I also have a mystery that I've reviewed by Randall Silvis. I review about 3 books per week, so I really am reading a lot. I have a list of tips for you, but before I get into that, I want to pause for a moment and say any questions about what I've proposed, that this is what gives a story or a feature or even a poem its strength, that match of the beginning and the end. I'm watching the chat, watching for you. Chris, what can you tell us about the beginning and ending of that number 3 trending story that you've got on Medium? Hey, Laura. What I've been proposing is that what makes a strong, memorable piece, whether it's poetry, fiction, there you go, Jwandalyn. Wandalyn? Can you see the title? Okay, I'll put it up in the chat in a moment. That what makes a story memorable and satisfying is that the ending somehow fits the promise that you made in the beginning. And often we aren't even aware that we've made a promise to a reader. But a story is really a triangle. It's the story that we're telling, but the person receiving it has their own life that they're matching it up with. So if, for instance, you've been a victim of sexual abuse, which I think is 1 in 4 Americans at this point, and you begin to read a story that's like that, right? You're going to be reading your own story within it all the time, and you may not even finish the book because it's going to be tracking so many things inside you. If you are a teacher and you're reading it, you're looking for something else. If you are simply fascinated with plot or fascinated with serial molesters, you're going to read it in another way. So the story underneath is a combination of what you've written, what the person reading it brings to it, and the words and your life that you've put into it. Oh, Chris, I'm so sorry for your loss. There's nothing I think as difficult as death of someone we care about. And I'm really sorry that your oldest brother died before you really got to know him as an adult. To find the people who knew him must be an incredible journey. And now I want to read the things that you're writing because you've just made a promise to me. You've promised me that I'm going to read loss and grief, but I'm also going to read a search and a quest, and I'm going to feel something in that story. Am I making sense with the idea of the promise that we make as we open a story or a poem or a feature article? Okay. Thanks, Laura. One way to notice how other people are handling this is to go to writers conventions, writers conferences, and listen to people talking about their stories. One of the things that always happens to me at a conference like that is that I'll meet people whose work I haven't yet read, and I'll listen to them talking publicly and say, they're talking about something I care about, or they're showing a use of language that makes me very interested in their work. And that takes me home to ordering some of their books or going to the bookstore for some of them, going to the library, and it enriches my life. Nice comments going on in the chat. I'm grateful that you all are taking care of each other. That's a wonderful thing. And that's one of the things that I think also we give with good writing is we take care of each other with it. In my book, The Darkness Under the Water, which is probably the most controversial book I've written, I had been the editor of a book on the eugenics project in Vermont and learned how horribly and unfairly it targeted the Native Americans in Vermont, the Abenaki people. And the book opens with the protagonist, a teenage girl, hating April hating the smell of it, the wet sheep smell of it in the 1930s. And it ends with her having discovered something that she can like in April because she's found a way to like herself. And that doesn't mean that she hasn't had losses along the way. She's already lost her sister when the book opens. Her mother dies, her grandmother dies, but there are things that happen in between that make her stronger and more determined to be her true self. So this too is one of those things that we're making a promise for. Does it need to be a promise and fulfilling it, or can a book merely make a character capable of something? I think that's exactly what I just described, that the character by the end of the book is more capable. Yes, the change is a promise, and yes, it fits in with the idea of the character arc. But one of the things that's been useful to me about trying to match the beginning and end is all of those of you who write something that's longer than 3 lines, is that at some point you say, oops, I'm stuck. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know why I started this. I don't know what the next part is. And some people call it writer's block. I call it time to ask the question. It's time to ask what you've promised at the beginning. So here come the tips. You know how they talk about reporters having questions that they ask? Who, what, when, where, how? I ask the same kinds of questions. What is your beginning? What's your end? And what do you get out of it? If you're nowhere near the end yet, you're still at the beginning, and you're sort of guessing where you might be going, one way to firm that up is to go back and look at the first paragraph you wrote, because that first paragraph often comes from something that's been stewing inside you for a while. You have made a promise in that first paragraph. Even if later on you cut it out, you've made a promise to yourself about what you're going to talk about. Yep, you got it, 3 W's and a 1 H. Who are you talking to? If you're stuck, picture the person that you've been telling this story to. I will often picture my sister. I have major problems with my sister, and yet she's intelligent, she's demanding, she's emotional, and if I can reach her with a story, I've done a good job. So if I reach a point where I'm stuck, I think, well, what is my sister expecting from the next page? And then sometimes it will come to me. How do you want this writing to change the reader? Many of us are writing things that are on the edge of social issues. Many of us are asking for voices that haven't been heard before or that have been repressed in the past. Certainly all of queer writing is asking for a new way of being heard. So how will this writing change the reader? Will it make the reader understand that someone different from them is actually the same in the heart? Or that being different in the heart is okay? That there's an essential richness to life that comes from reading the people that you're writing about? How is the reader going to change you? Because that will happen. When you finish a book and you take it out, when I take The Long Shadow out and talk with people about it, this is actually about the 10 years before the Civil War in the United States. And readers haven't really thought intensely about what led up to the moment of war being declared. A lot of people know about the war, and a lot of people are reading about enslavement. But the lives of ordinary people as they move from being focused on their daily lives to deciding that there's an issue nationally that's worth fighting for. That's where I'm trying to probe. So my reader should change from what I've written. It doesn't have to be the case for everything you write, but it's a question worth asking. I often pause and say, which books are the best things I've read recently? And think about how they have sort of rung a bell in me and look for that same note that I can bring back in. And if I haven't already done it, I look back at the where. Where is this work located? Why did I put it there? And how can I emphasize that? So to go with that, I also ask myself, what have I done with my 5 senses in the last few pages? Right? Seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching. If I haven't had all 5 senses in there, then I can pull the next sense, and that often gives me the next piece of the story. It's a funny thing to say, but it seems to work. 2 other tips for today, and then I'll stop for more questions. One is keep a word list of words that matter to your story or words that matter in terms of the feelings you're having as you write this. And when you pause, go back and look at that word list and see whether you can enrich the piece that you're writing more with one of those words. For a poem, that word list can sometimes become half of the poem's words eventually. But just to have the list gives me a sense, again, of what promise have I made? What am I offering? What do I want to give? What do I want the reader to give back to me? And the last part, there is a book that was written as a teenager's book in the 1950s called A Wrinkle in Time. And in it, it's a speculative fiction book. And one of the older characters is trying to explain how you can collapse time and distance and get from one planet to another. And she says, imagine that you have a piece of string between your two hands, and there's an ant crawling along it. And for an ant, that piece of string is a long way to walk. But if you put your hands together, the ant can walk from one to the other. And the string dangles down in between. So when you are writing a story, there's a beginning, and even if you don't know it yet, there's an ending that fits, that satisfies. And if you can get even half an idea of it, then you pull those apart in yourself and you look and you say, what's the string that connects it? How does my piece of writing go from here to here? And I think in the most dramatic fiction, that string does not go straight across. It goes woof, 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 woof. And sometimes there's a pair of scissors threatening to cut it. But if you can visualize the string, again, connecting the beginning to the end, pull on it and see where you get. I'm seeing 3 names coming up in moderation, and I'm not sure what to do with them. I'm going to try tapping on an X and see whether that helps. Probably didn't. Chris, that's a really good point about using the passive voice too much. And I do try to take out the passive voice almost everywhere. If I find myself using the expression, she had done something or they had done something as a sort of insert into a story to explain a decision, I know I've goofed because I should have introduced the actual item back when it was happening instead of saying, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you that she'd already put her shoes on. No, the shoes part needs to come in sooner. So that's one of the things I look for in addition to the passive voice. Anything that says was or were, I look for a stronger verb. A noted prize-winning sports reporter that I knew would go back through his work looking for the word that and taking out 90% of the uses of it. And he said it almost always made his piece stronger. Anybody else have tips they want to share on how they look for stronger writing for themselves? This, good one, Laura. Yep. Reading aloud and finding the pauses. Yes, yes. And I would think if you're writing in a language that's not your first language, that reading aloud becomes even more important. You want to feel the mouth feel of that other language. If you're also writing a character who's not very much like you, reading aloud helps because you start to get a sense of how that character is talking and you see where you've accidentally slipped back to your own way of talking. You want to hold that character's difference as clearly as you can. Topic sentence as the first sentence of the paragraph. Yeah, nice. And yes, things sound different. Poets probably are the most attached to reading something out loud in order to hear where it's missing something, where it's got bumps in it. First paragraph gets removed. Yes. Excuse me for not knowing how to pronounce your name. I'm going to guess it's Matiu, and I like it very much that the first paragraph is usually a waffle. I often find I cut the first chapter of a longer piece also, because in some sense, it's me getting into it. It's me fiddling around on the edge of the water and not quite ready to jump. So if I look for where especially if I'm reading it aloud to myself, if I look for where I suddenly feel more interested, then everything before that can temporarily go. One caution, don't delete it entirely. Copy and paste it and put it on another piece on your machine or on your piece of paper where you can go back to it later, because you may in fact find that there was something in it that you'd forgotten about that was significant to what you were promising. A notes file of discarded sections, nice. Am I a plotter or a pantser? I'm becoming more of a plotter, but only in one specific area. A great mystery writer once told his grandmother's tips, mother's tips for strong writing. And she said that in crime fiction, the one thing you must know is how the crime itself took place. So everything else can be seat of the pants, which is what we call a pantser. But the actual crime needs to be utterly known so that it makes sense when you take it all apart. Plotter all the way, nice. There's a Vermont author of horror fiction, and I'm not going to be able to pull her name right up off the top of my head, but if you read horror fiction, you've read her. And she covers her wall with sticky tabs in different colors and then lays them out on a piece of paper also and rearranges them. So that's a great way to move segments apart. But what, for me, to just go back and recap, my discovery, especially as a reviewer, was that the strongest work makes a promise to the reader in the beginning and satisfies the promise at the end. Anybody else use Scrivener? I see Mireille is mentioning it. I'm a word person all the way. Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, Laura. I'll have to experiment with it one of these days. I also tend to scribble things on lined pads before I start writing. And that lets me mark things in that have to get inserted in different ways. All right. Handwriting and then typing. That's classic, Laura. Thanks. All right. We're down to 3 minutes. Yes, everything in different files, totally accessible. Nice, Lillian. And whiteboards. I agree. Thanks, Rob. Miro, I don't know, and I'll have to take a look at it. All right. Anyone have a tip for recognizing really good writing when you're producing it? Nice, Chris. Thank you. Mind mapping. Word and OneNote. I see you, DE. Mireille, it's a pleasure. All right. So I have one more tiny tip, and I learned it working minimalistic. And we got some interesting comments in there on Teams. I hope you're all watching the chat. I did learn one more tip for myself because I do write a lot on Medium, and that is whatever I write, to write the first sentence of the next piece before I stop for the night, so that I know where I'm going, so I know what was important to me at least the night before. And in its way, that's a promise to myself also. Thank you all for coming, and I'll see you on Medium, I'm sure. I'd be thrilled if you would read some of my pieces there. I think you might find some good adventures, and I'll be watching for yours. Thanks. A pleasure. Right. Hope you're going to something terrific next. I really am enjoying Medium Day. This idea of quick bites with many different kinds of writers is such a thrill, and I hope we do it again next year. Thank you all. I'll be watching for you. I'm really glad this is being recorded so that I can look down through the chat, pick up all your names, and get reading. Because that, if I haven't really expressed it, that is what makes us stronger writers, is reading the really good stuff. I have a new policy. I'm 71 and life suddenly seems short. If it's not good writing, I put it down and I don't read it. Give it away, put it in a little free library, turn it over to the town library, whatever. I want to read the really good stuff so that I'm writing the good stuff. Just like the old computer programmers used to say, garbage in, garbage out. And the converse of that is good stuff in, good stuff out. Let's write with power, write with strength, and keep that promise to the reader. Yes, Mireille, it is. And thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks, Bella. Thanks, Emma and Terry and Wendy and Laurie. And wow. A bientôt. Have a good night, you all.